we've got some very interesting companies up here that are doing what we call intelligent efficiency. Some call it the enterprise smart grid, using data analytics to make energy efficiency, demand response, tangible, trackable units, just like energy production. And so we're going to talk about how they're doing that and how they're making buildings smarter so that they can be good citizens on the networked smart grid. So joining us is Mike Kaplan. He is the VP of Marketing at Retro Efficiency, a company doing building analytics. They started off as a virtual auditor and are identifying efficiency opportunities for utilities. We have Brad Witter, who is the CTO of Blue Pillar, and they do building systems and building energy management for critical facilities. And then Badri Raghavan, who is the CTO of First Fuel, another analytics provider that, again, started off doing virtual audits and has since expanded to identifying broader efficiency opportunities for utilities and commercial buildings. And of course, they just entered a partnership with First Fuel, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So maybe we could start with Retro Efficiency and First Fuel, and Mike, we'll start with you. I think you guys would both say, no, we're not virtual auditing companies. You both expanded your platform over the years. You started off as such, but how would you describe yourself now? And I think a lot of people would assume that you're doing basically the same thing. How would you differentiate yourself?
Yeah, well, Retro Efficiency, in terms of where we're really focused, is helping utilities drive analytics-enabled programs so that they can drive more energy efficiency savings in less time and cost. You know, I think over time where we've really focused is on two levels, from where we started off a couple of years ago. One is at the analytics layer, so really taking where we started off from, looking at we started off looking at very detailed building asset data to interval meter data to now looking at, well, what can we do with very limited amounts of data, monthly data. So we focused on that kind of layer, and then secondly, really building out software to enable a process. So in the commercial and industrial energy efficiency space, it's a very fragmented value chain. You have, starting with the utility to maybe a program implementer, you have trade allies, all of those and product vendors before you reach the end building owner. So making sure that our analytics can help inform better data-driven decisions throughout that process is very important.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of utility customers have you pulled in thus far? Where are you working?
Yeah, so I think we're working a little over 20 utility programs today. So some of the public ones, Con Edison, working with PG&E, Efficiency Maine, Efficiency Vermont.
And you're basically just saying, here's where the best efficiency opportunities are in commercial buildings.
Yeah, I mean, it's a couple of different flavors to it. Ultimately, it is about driving those savings. So it could start at a very high portfolio level. How do I rationalize and segment all of these different commercial accounts that I have? So I did a project that was 300,000 meters because the utility just literally didn't know where to start, to more focused efforts around, is it a segment like small to mid-sized businesses that I haven't been able to tap, or a certain type of measure. Operational savings is a very, big emerging flavor of where, these analytics are dovetailing that kind of can help us drive more savings.
Great. Badri, you want to riff on that and talk about how you're working with utilities and how you've expanded from the simple virtual audit into a broader platform analysis, and then you're actually working with, I think, and Retro Efficiency is doing this as well, working with some program administrators to try to help execute projects more and engage building owners on actually getting projects done.
Yep.
Talk about
Stephen,
that evolution.
Well, but just before that, a quick correction. I think when you introduced, I think you meant to say our partnership with O-Power.
Did I not say O-Power?
Partnership with First Fuel. So
oh, yeah.
Of course, we're partnering with ourselves,
Yeah.
but it's the big news. The big news is with O-Power.
Yes.
We're very excited. Thank you for calling that out. We are very, very excited for that. It's sort of a culmination of many months of working together behind the scenes to offer this seamless package of solutions to a utility all the way from residential to the large commercial. So thank you for acknowledging that. To come back to the question about how do you distinguish yourselves, so our focus is, what the utilities are telling us is that the challenges they are now facing have expanded beyond the original, simple identification to the broader question of how do you have effective program administration? How do you engage with customers, especially on the in the commercial and industrial side, also on the residential side, of course, but we focus on, as you know, on the commercial and industrial side. And so there are two categories the way we look at the world. One is this notion of very broad engagement with the utilities customers. So for example, looking at an entire portfolio of a utility service territory, and what our partners are telling us is how do you drive them to get, for example, greater uptake on the efficiency programs they have in place today. As many of you probably know, these are typically the uptake on these programs are anywhere from 1% to 5% at best. So what we come up and we partner with them is through our deep analytics, we help to sort of tailor the right programs, work with the right program administrator partners to more effectively target their spend, so that the magic number utilities are looking for is this ratio of dollars per kilowatt hour, right? So you want to drive down the dollar spend in the numerator and drive up the kilowatt hours in the denominator. So both our deep engagement and our broad engagement platforms work towards that goal to satisfy utilities.
And you're actually following up. I mean, rather than sending one message saying this is your opportunity, you're doing continuous follow-up. And
that's correct. So
any results? Can you talk about how that increases potential project execution?
Yes, we have. In fact, one of the ways that we measure that engagement is to follow up on an ongoing basis through our remote monitoring service, for example, for which sort of tracks when buildings and customers actually start to implement these energy conservation measures. How do you actually ratify, validate whether what was installed, what they took these large rebate checks for, what they paid large capital costs for, did that actually result in savings? So we're working directly through our product offerings, but as well as with our partners to track those efficiency savings. We have lots of very promising internal results. We can talk about in terms of somewhere between 3 and 8x upticks we've seen in the degree of uptake within these programs. So very, very large jump, which is directly attributable to the fact that the analytics, for example, points to very specific measures that make sense, both operational as well as these capital intensive retrofit projects. So the initial results have been very, very encouraging from that perspective. Yeah.
Brad, over to you. You're operating in a different environment here, doing systems management for critical facilities. What role does energy play in that? And who are your target customers? It sounds like it's like healthcare facilities and military facilities.
Right. I mean, critical power, you have government bases, hospital, healthcare, data centers, universities with research and those kind of facilities. And we found that energy efficiency and energy management, if not part of a larger package as far as what they were trying to accomplish from a facility management perspective, fell on deaf ears a little bit, walking in the door saying, hey, I know you're a critical facility and power is just something you're assuming is table stakes. It's going to be on and you're going to use as much as you need to drive the research or the patient safety, et cetera, that you need to maintain your facilities. But when we were able to maintain or connect that energy efficiency with operational savings and resiliency around aging workforce and even from a emergency response from an outage perspective, we were able to take what they really wanted as an operational facility customer, that would aid them in their day-to-day basis, and marry them with programs that had traditionally not been able to be awarded to these customers, like demand response. And so we've seen a lot of healthcare facilities that would typically say there is no way we are doing demand response. Have you seen the emergency room sign off the front of the door when you came in? To, you know what, if that's a broader offering within this total package that will help us make our facilities safer and more resilient to outside factors like weather or just utility disturbances, we've had a lot much stickier adoption of those programs, so they don't just do it for the first year and then say it's not worth it. When it's all encompassing, we found a much stickier offering, and that they'll stay with that energy efficiency approach because it's serving the greater good from their perspective in a critical power environment specifically.
Yeah, so the energy considerations are secondary for your customers?
Yeah, in a lot of cases they are. Now, what's interesting, if you flip that out and take that's really from the mindset of a single site. If you take a multi-system or multi-site offering, like a Tenet Healthcare, for example, that might have 85 individual facilities, they do start pivoting because the local sites need to be perfectly resilient. Kind of, they're working at the bigger budget items and saying, hey, I've got a $50 million spend. If I could save just 10% of that, that would help us to the bottom line. So when it flips to a more of a centralization field, which we see a lot happening in some of the critical environments like healthcare, that's when operational or energy efficiency does become much more of a push down to say, hey, you really need to save money on electricity, and we need to figure out how to do that. So we are seeing a pivot there, but then that gets into the nuances of how do you have the single sites want to adopt the things that the centralized management oversight want to do, and it really is about balancing all those needs and making sure everyone wins.
Yeah, and just a follow-up, what exactly are you connecting? Like, give us a sense for what your system is bringing together, and does it compete with like a Johnson Controls Panoptics software or
Right.
something else that we?
No, that's a good question. We
typically
get that a
think of?
lot. Traditionally, the BMS and BAS systems have not really, and we don't see a lot of penetration into the electrical side of a lot of these organizations. So the switchgear, the utility metering, the wages metering, the backup generation, even some of the code generation, we don't see a lot of overlap in that. So where we see kind of a connectivity is we'll become a subscriber to a lot of the data that the BMS or BAS might have on a central plant management perspective. So we really kind of sit outside the central plant and say, hey, the central plant's going to be managed by someone like Johnson, Siemens, or Honeywell. And we're working with them on a lot of our critical power environments as more of a collaborative partnership to say, hey, you do what you do, we'll do what we do, and consolidate that all to a single point of interface from an energy management perspective so that we interact with their systems as necessary. So we see ourselves more in partnership with those organizations than we really do seeing any kind of overlap, because they're really focused historically on the mechanical central plant optimization side.
Mike, how are your offerings changing, adapting based on what utilities are telling you and asking for?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but relative to what we saw in the market a couple of years ago, it is about what can you do with less data is one kind of trend, and then in a lot of cases, can you give me more of a full solution? So not just the software, but can you bring in partners, right? So we have a lot of different pilot programs where, as opposed to, maybe 2 years ago where, a program administrator might bring us into a particular opportunity, we're now starting to bring them into different opportunities such that, we can actually fully execute on that. As Badru was touching on, at the end of the day, it's kilowatt hour savings and doing that at a lower cost. So oftentimes, in order to do that and show that value, you have to bring that full solution to market.
In what cases do you not have enough data? Is that pretty common at utility customers, or give us an
I mean,
example
it's just right. We're in sunny California, land of smart meters. It's great, right? Interval data is a great starting point. But I mentioned, just working on an engagement with 300,000 meters. 95% of those are monthly. So you're talking about moving from 35,000+ data points to 12 data points. It's a very different problem. in terms of what insights can you get, and then how do you package that appropriately to get customers interested.
And then I want to ask you about geo-targeting as well, which is a focus of the company. Geo-targeting been used since the 90s or so. Now we have better software and analytical tools to identify opportunities to avoid new infrastructure build out. What type of geo-targeting are you doing and for whom? And have you seen any examples where utilities are able to find efficiency opportunities and not build out a piece of infrastructure, say?
Yeah, I mean, our main customer that we're working with on that specific application is Con Edison. Also doing, contrast that with Efficiency Vermont, so you kind of have this interesting dichotomy of New York versus Vermont. But, there we're obviously focused on driving and looking at identifying peak demand savings, in terms of what can you do from an efficiency standpoint or a demand response standpoint at those critical peak periods. So Con Edison has, they're one of the leaders in this space and have long kind of leveraged lots of different technologies to push off the need for infrastructure development. So I think really what they see as analytics as an enabler to do that faster, better, cheaper, and further along into the future.
How much cheaper? I mean, can you give us any cost estimates, like versus building a substation or something? Do you have any metrics that might be helpful for us that you guys have?
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, relative to building a substation, I'm not really sure. I recently read something, I think on the order of over the next decade or so, utilities, we need to invest roughly $500 billion, or we're planning to invest $500 billion into the grid just to meet growing load and with aging infrastructure. But that was about $100 billion short of really what it needed to be. So I think a lot of utilities, regulators are starting to really ask the question, how much, and really need to, how much can we scale efficiency, demand response as a tool to mitigate that.
Badri, let's talk a little bit more about this O-Power partnership. Mike was talking about the need for integration, and this is, of course, an important piece of integration for both O-Power and First Fuel. Gives you access to a lot of customers that O-Power has. They have 95 utility customers. O-Power now has access to your commercial data analytics, and they were very active in small business and residential, and now have access to commercial, and you have this 3-tiered platform that you've been working on for many months. What are utilities asking for? I mean, that was clearly what utilities were asking you guys for.
Exactly. So that's exactly right. Utilities are, recently are, you asked an earlier question about what's different from a few years ago, right? So especially with, we were viewed as this remote audit platform, remote audit sort of tool. And so a few years ago, it was about validating this technology, whether it went through or not. So we sort of went through this cycle of, multiple sort of third-party validations. And what we found increasingly in the past, year or so is utilities are looking at once, in other words, we sort of passed that credibility test. Once you pass that credibility test, generally as sort of an analytics-driven retrocommissioning or lead generation sort of way of looking at program management, then the question our sort of utility partners are saying, look, you and O-Power seem to have sort of similar worldviews in, for example, leveraging data for achieving large-scale program-level savings goals, instead of dealing with multiple niche providers and sort of very narrowly focused products, we saw this increased demand for sort of a, if you wish, a one-stop shop, if you wish. And we kept hearing this, O-Power kept hearing this from their very large customer base. We keep hearing it, so it made a lot of sense for us to join forces. And as you correctly said, one of the things that we, at First Fuel, we sort of pride ourselves in the amount of investment we made in our technology capabilities, right? After all, the CTO, I need to make a plug for this. But We have 8 PhDs on staff here, machine learning experts who are, from the Harvards and Stanfords and, MITs of the world. So we are now able to leverage potentially this enormous amount of new data that's coming to us to come up with new ways to service our utility customers, right? So you asked about, part of the question was about what else, are you hearing from your utility partners? So for example, one big part I already referred to was about program administration costs, expanding your marketing dollar budget, but achieving your increasing targets. But a second piece of it is also about increasingly, the equation is moving towards customer empowerment, and a view that OPower and us, we both share that worldview, that how do we make customers more empowered to make their energy solutions? It's a different equation in the commercial space than in the residential, of course. But so we're coming up with new ways, for example, to not just do geo-targeting, like you were talking about, which is very effective, but then to add a dimension, for example, to say, here you are identifying your energy savings opportunities, right, on one axis, but just, treating buildings as these sort of physical entities without people inside them is a little strange. After all, buildings are sort of purpose-built structures. They're built, commercial buildings, with sort of a lot of demographic things going on inside. So as an example, what this new sort of data and expanded worldview is helping us do is, for example, add on a layer of not just sort of potential to save, but a propensity to act, for example, right? So again, coming back to what are utilities interested in? They're interested in results, right? How many dollars did you, save me in my program administration budget, and how much did that result in?
Yeah.
Dollars per kWh. So if you can now say, not only can you point out what are your most interesting targets to go after, but also, what's your, which among them are most likely to act, that's a winning combination. So these are some of the ways we are starting to leverage some of these ideas and partnerships, for example.
All right, so let's forget that we're being webcast and forget all these people in the room. Just between you and me, is OPower going to acquire you? Do you think you'll be an OPower? I know you're not going to answer that question.
Well, let's just say we have not talked about, and certainly that's not my role to play that. We are, let me reiterate here, it may be a little hard to believe, but Dan and Swapshire, our CEO, do share a very personal, close relationship. We share a similar worldview. What the future holds, who knows? We're just happy for the present, where we now have this ability to really leverage this wonderful opportunity.
So Brad, we talked a little bit about how these guys have been changing. I'm curious, you talked about resiliency playing a role in customer decision making, and of course GTM has been focused on that. We had an ebook, and we've been about post-grid planning efforts and how building owners were thinking about investments after Sandy, and I'm just curious how that's influenced customer decision making at these critical facilities.
Well, certainly any awareness that comes along with maintaining and managing critical power environments is good for business when critical power is kind of your mainstay. But I think the awareness, what we've noticed specifically in New York City after Sandy, is again a more open mind to how some of the energy efficiency opportunities like demand response might drive the ability towards more resiliency. So a lot of the things that you're doing in an outage and a response, making yourself more resilient, is also what you need to do to protect yourself from the outside. So whether it be a utility disturbance or unreliable power, or whether it be the weather throwing something at you, we see this as kind of again, the portfolio of critical power management being, you need to test, you need to be resilient, you need to be able to respond to outages. We see that really all kind of playing together and really helping with our message as far as, hey, these behaviors on the energy resiliency side and energy saving side is really somewhat of a test for what you're going to do in an outage and how you're going to respond. So the more What we found that we like about this is it's helping customers stay more engaged in the energy programs and in managing their energy, because it's also part of something they're very scared of. So even the people who might say, you know what, we're a well-funded organization, we really don't care about the utility bills, and there are some that, you know, kind of take that stance. If it helps them kind of in their portfolio manage, well, this is how I can get better and how I can be safer and how I can really market myself as a safer place from an operational perspective. We're seeing a lot of benefits of that gaining steam, you know, after these natural disasters are kind of raising the awareness to say, we need to be better about how we're managing this, because a more energy efficient infrastructure and facilities probably a better energy efficient response to an outage. You know, so it all works together to, I think, building better and smarter buildings.
Are any of your customers thinking about or developing microgrids or thinking about battery storage? How do you see that evolving in terms of what customers are evaluating?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So of the, you know, I'll just give you some, of the 150 or so sites that we have live and operational, only one of those has, well, actually outside the military, so let's just talk about healthcare for a second. One or two of those have explicitly been on the journey towards creating their own smart grid-enabled microgrid, you know, from a response and management perspective. So we see, you know, really any critical power infrastructure is like a microgrid because it does have the ability to self-generate. So there's another way to look at it to say every one of our clients, because they're critical power and have backup self-generation capabilities, as a microgrid, you know, from an autonomous power supply perspective. So from that perspective, we see a lot more proactive integration into their response systems to act like a microgrid from a energy security perspective. But on the storage side, that's very interesting. You know, I think there are some compliance issues in healthcare, specifically with Joint Commission and some of the things, you know, as far as monkeying around with incoming feeds from the utility. But, you know, that aside, I think it's a very ripe, you know, big data centers in healthcare and all these resiliency situations, because the batteries are neat from the perspective of they're not seen downstream. And really interruptions is what everyone's really trying to protect from. So the ability of a microgrid or a storage solution to really make the utility more of a backup source, you know, per se, is a great thing from a critical power infrastructure perspective, and definitely aligned with what they'd like to see.
Let's talk about customer behavior, and maybe we can talk about people, not your customers per se, but the folks inside the buildings who your customers are trying to reach. For both first fuel and retro efficiency, we talked a little bit about this when I asked you about turnover and how to message to folks. But let's start with you, Mike. Why are people not implementing efficiency projects? What do you have to do to get them to respond to those cues? And how can you make that better?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the highest level, I mean, people, a lot of times people will ask us, oh, what's the best segment that you should target? You know, what's the best building type? What's the best measure? And I really push back there and say, fundamentally, from where we are as an industry today versus where we need to go, is the biggest reason, in my mind, is that people don't have access to, the right people don't have even the access to the information that they need to even get started and think about it. So there's a really big tranche of customers and opportunities that if you can move the needle on giving those insights kind of at that scale that we're talking about, they really will move. And it is about also that continuous engagement. You're not going to, you know, relative to, you know, just when the term virtual audit, the term audit, right, in the industry is a very much a one-time thing. And if you're only looking at it on a one-time basis, that engagement, that touch point, you're only going to get a small sliver of, or not the maximum amount of customers that you could otherwise pull in. So, you know, there is a very much, I'm the marketer, so it's about touching those customers over and over and over again to pull through as many as you can. And there's a lot to learn, right, over time. Audrey mentioned about, you know, propensity, so pulling in other types of segmentation beyond just the energy analytics is very important, and honing those messages over time. You know, it's kind of the next stage is where I see, you know, the market going.
Yeah, I think this buzz phrase, customer engagement, is very important. And Baudry talked about First Fuel and O-Power's view of the world, and I think O-Power's view of the world has been very clear in terms of how it reaches out to customers, and that customer engagement piece is really crucial. And I seem to remember, correct me if I'm wrong, when we met maybe this spring, that in the conversation you guys were saying that like that customer engagement piece wasn't a huge strategy. Can you elaborate on that? And what's your view of the world on what that means for what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, customer engagement is critical. I think the way we think about it, there's two starting places that a utility might think about it, and usually it's different people within the utility world that might ask one of these other two questions. So one is, how do I better engage my customers? So if that's your first question, you might be thinking about that in terms of how can I improve satisfaction? How can I increase loyalty over time as other competitive dynamics? How can I position myself as a utility to potentially tap into other value streams in the future as my business model change, as regulatory dynamics shift? That's a very important problem. And then the second question is that somebody might ask is, how do I drive kilowatt hour savings? So in that context, customer engagement is a piece of that process. And before that, you might have the targeting and segmentation element before you're doing that engagement. After it, you need to convert those projects by connecting the entire value chain. So certainly engagement is critical in either case, but I think sort of what's your starting point, what are you trying to solve for, is all relative in terms of the level of importance or where you put that.
And when I say that phrase, so O-Power, they're talking about integrating calling and billing and really trying to take over some of those back-end processes that are that could integrate well with its existing outreach to customers.
Right.
Do you see the world in that way when you talk about customer engagement?
We do absolutely, with some differences, and I'll spend a couple minutes talking about that, which are specific to the fact that while they address the residential and the small business segment, we do the medium and large commercial facilities. So O-Power is very well known for its sort of reaching customers with these specific event times. When people move in, when people move out, there's a new connection coming in, or after a storm or an outage. So there's the impact that this customer touch has a lot to do with when that actually happens. So that's sort of philosophy that goes back, and from First Fuel's perspective, we look at it not just that we can learn and leverage that sort of philosophy, these sort of, we call it 12 touches in 12 months. You have the right offering to right insight. It's simply sending an email or sending a pamphlet is not enough. It needs to be relevant, especially because we're dealing a lot with professional energy managers on the commercial side. It's, for example, not sufficient to sort of give some broad-based generic recommendations or insight. It needs to be targeted, it needs to be credible, it needs to be specific to that facility at that moment. So for example, if we can, and this is something we do, we say, look, based on your building's past history and the way it's responding to the external weather conditions, there's a summer peak event coming up, watch out, right? This is a way where your historical data is showing that you are, perhaps you need to watch the way your cooling systems are operating during these summer peak hours. So an insight like that, prior to an event happening, or it could be a seasonal thing, for example. So these are the ways that you engage with the commercial partners in specific, credible, and important times, let me put it that way. So that, hopefully that sort of answers the question.
Brad, when you go to a customer, are you trying to sell them something shiny and new and talk about intelligence in the building, or are you just saying, we can do this better, we can make your building more resilient, or we can keep it safe? How do you get the customer to act? What drives them? I know it's probably different.
That's the
for each
multi-million-dollar
customer,
question, isn't it? We've had a difficult time with that, and to some extent, we've had to decide who we're going to talk to and what we're going to be to them, because I think the different audiences have a very different response to what they want. Certainly, in our particular segment of the industry, the shiny new object inside the building doesn't get us very far. And we tried to be that shiny new object. And honestly, we said microgrid, and this will impact my professional career for the rest of my life. We were selling on, hey, do you know you have a microgrid? To a customer who legitimately had a microgrid, they just didn't know that. And the guy giggled so long, he had to excuse himself for a couple minutes to come back and it's like, okay, I'm sorry about that. That was unprofessional. Because he honestly, linking that up to kind of that high-class energy efficiency thing was just so foreign to him. He's like, guys, you realize what I'm dealing with. I've got, my roof is leaking. I've got all these things that you don't understand. I don't have time to think about how to polish, the doors and the windows.
So that person's not going to be excited about the Internet of Things necessarily.
No, it's not, and that's a big part of our offering. But if we went in and said, hey, we have an Internet of Things approach to how we connect this, and this will all be good. But if we were to go in and say, hey, that existing effort that you have that's slowed, that 12-month cycle that it took to get that meter data management program there because you want to do some NEC load studies and ongoing, continuous commissioning, we can do that faster and cheaper. Those things start making a little bit more sense. But when we come in at more the system level and see sites that are being managed by more of a central organization, that has much more of a shiny new object feel from the perspective of they're managing a portfolio of sites and they're looking at their overall corporate objectives and goals, and they're much closer to the money, so they're willing to do things and push things down to the individual sites that might not, they're a little further away from the pain points that the roof's leaking, they really don't want to hear about. They want to hear about whether they're going to get incentivized in the fact that they save 10% of energy over their portfolio. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that I really answered the question other than to say it depends at what level we go into. The bigger the bigger the impact the audience has, the more likely they are to respond to building efficiency and shiny new objects. The lower we are in the chain, if we're selling to a single site, it's very much boots on the street, kind of dealing with the issues that are right in front of them.
Yeah. The "it depends" response is no, it's the common response. I mean, it very definitely varies. I just lost my train of thought and forgot what I was going to ask you. Let's go to questions real quick while I gather my thoughts, because I had a follow-up question to that. Does anyone have a question?
So many questions, but I want to take advantage of this opportunity. On the prior panel, I'd asked if that group had moved into the commercial space, and the answer was no across the board. You all are obviously in the commercial space, and so I'm trying to understand how far down you go in terms of size of commercial entity that you would have any interest in participating with.
I can tell we don't put a lower floor limit on where the commercial efficiency is. In fact, that's a great question because at the highest end, it's more traditional approaches, in fact, become more cost-effective, right? If you're trying to make the Empire State Building more energy efficient, you can afford, the size of the savings and so on are so big that you can afford to do the boots on the ground approach. And is in fact on the opposite end of the spectrum where the traditional approaches fail. They're simply not cost effective. But if you look at the distribution of buildings by size, by consumption, by demand, you find this very, very long tail on the lower end of the spectrum. These don't get love, never have. But more and more as the high end is getting picked over, right? So in terms of the lighting retrofits are all sort of done. Your regulators are telling you to be much more, the expectations are rising. In California, there's Title 24. Even if you're below Title 24, you don't get credit for it until you bring it up above code. So there are multiple challenges these buildings are facing, and it is virtually impossible to address that on this massive scale. The PUCs are also worried about equity. Energy efficiency can't just be about serving your largest customers. It needs to serve your mom and pop shops. So in fact, a big part, and in fact, why our partnership with OPower is particularly helpful is that expansion of our, the worldview of commercial from not just the Empire State, but across the board. And our research, for instance, has shown that, over half all of potential savings are available in that sort of small to medium market range. And it's a longer question, discussion now how exactly you go about addressing it. But that's very much a focus of the sort of analytics-enabled energy efficiency opportunities.
Mike, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean, similar thoughts. I think where the analytics really helps is making you smarter about how you actually engage those customers. So, if it's purely a digital or print type of campaign to very, very small customers, today utilities are might be only leveraging account managers for their largest customers. But what we found is, for example, a very high potential building on a percentage basis might be able to save 40% cost effectively, whereas a low potential building might only save 3%. So that's a 14x difference. And what that means is you might have a mid-size or smaller building that's a 14th the size of a large building, and it makes more sense to actually engage that one first, and it might make economical sense to use higher types of communications channels. So I think it's just about getting smarter about how we segment those different groups, and you really want to touch every single customer.
Brad, I remember what my follow-up question was, which was, you're offering this cloud-based solution. So critical facilities, do they want their data out in the cloud? And I think we hear people talking about cloud-based offerings for utilities, and a lot of utilities don't want them because they're afraid of, they want on-site equipment, they don't want the information out in the cloud. Do you find that same problem in building energy management?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, starting at the core, anybody attempting to tackle the critical infrastructure problems is cybersecurity is at the forefront, and not because it's over spoken about, but because it's undervalued as far as how important it is. Because what we see when we get into these critical facilities is really, really scary from what's already been done and kind of what's out there. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity to help secure that more. And it's interesting if you look at a lot of the Microsoft, for example, put out some studies, as far as their cloud adoption of some of the things from a cloud-based infrastructure perspective, from an Active Directory, posting your credentials up in the cloud versus having them internal. And they found that, ultimately people do come to the realization that the big companies that have security on the forefront of their minds are better at doing it when you can kind of release that emotional control. But it's a tightrope for us. So it always comes down to what parts. I mean, a core part of our platform lives behind the firewall and does most of the day-to-day emergency response things. Because from a resiliency perspective, you don't want to have the cloud be a reliance to continue managing your local facility. So we kind of have a little bit of a hybridized solution of an on-site premise that kind of keeps the lights on and keeps things going. But then the demand response automation and all that, kind of the things that are necessitated by energy efficiency or big data analytics, that's going to happen up in the cloud. And we've kind of done the hand wrestling with those customers to say, if you want this capability and you want these things, that you're really going to have to rely on the cloud connectivity and technologies to do that. And then it becomes a little bit of a thumb wrestling match as far as going through the audits and the IT approvals to do that, and having a very solid story when pressed and asked for that.
Cool. All right, we're wrapping up here. We got to end the day. Just one last question, putting you on the spot here. What is the most interesting, compelling, counterintuitive, surprising finding that you found either across a portfolio of buildings or in a specific customer site? Like, what new insights has analytics given us about commercial buildings, for example, that we might not otherwise have found or would have taken longer to find?
Oh, wow. Great question. I mean, it's just almost difficult to answer, but let me take the short one, and I kind of touched upon it, this notion of propensity to act. The deeper we get into it with our partners, it's very, very interesting. As you come across, so what we found with one of our utility customers was, for example, after identifying the greatest sort of energy efficiency opportunities and sort of dollars per kilowatt hour sort of framework, when we applied this lens of this potential to act, right? What we found, for example, when this one particular utilities were the customers that bid out to a customer, to sort of a capacity bidding program that they participated in, for example, that single flag about buildings across their entire portfolio had a response rate to these programs about 10x of the average population, right? So the notion is that that is a completely counterintuitive, non-obvious sort of realization that why would a customer who bids out into this sort of third-party capacity bidding program be also the most attractive from terms of satisfying your program goals in the most energy efficient way. So it's a sort of deep analytics and looking at multiple dimensions, and that was, to me, was a very surprising insight and just points to where I think the industry needs to start thinking more about. Yeah.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, we love using data to prove our points. I mean, one of the charts that I always love to show, would be a little bit better visually, but to sort of talk about the value of analytics in that upfront targeting perspective is how what we're doing today, things like Energy Star, energy use intensity, exactly how poorly they actually correlate to what the cost-effective potential is in a building, these kind of single point benchmarks that pretty much are being used to prioritize by building owners or energy service providers really can just lead you in the wrong direction when your goal and objective is to save energy. Obviously, they have different benefits, but we always show this chart, just a big scatter plot, different use types, a couple hundred buildings, their Energy Star score plotted against their kind of cost-effective potential, and they're just dots everywhere. Mm-hmm. There's no correlation. It always really gets people excited and interesting. So.
And Brad, can you apply that question to specific customers or?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to me that no single customer of ours has really come away with the same surprise, like, wow, they really like that, and I didn't see that kind of coming. It was kind of a new nuance, and I think some of that is and on the customer adoption curve, we have found the reticence or the willingness to participate in something that is being brought in for them to change behavior. You could plot their inability to adopt that or their resistance to adopt that up against how badly they need it. Mm-hmm. And that's the interesting thing, that a lot of these customers, they're maintaining and managing their fiefdoms and really don't want anyone kind of coming in and putting so from an energy density perspective, Energy Star on the energy side, as well as on the operational efficiency side. It's been surprising to me that rather than having an open door, hey, come in and help, I'd love the help, I want more help, we'll get accused of breaking their equipment, and we'll get accused of all these bad things that we're doing. But if you plot that out 2 or 3 years down the road, it's amazing that those are the ones that say, if you took this out now, we'd have a fight on our hands because it's become so integral to helping me fix some of the problems that I have. But that's a tough hurdle to get over, where the people who need it most are sometimes the most apprehensive to adopt those programs. And that's where the nuance, I think the summary for me is the nuance is figuring out how everybody wins, and you do it without really exposing anyone's weaknesses, too much so that everyone can kind of feel like they won in the endeavor.
All right, well, let's thank Badri, Brad, and Mike. And appreciate it, guys. And stick around for just a minute because Rick has some closing thoughts.
Thanks, guys.